Grace Ashworth had been told to sit and say nothing, and she had very nearly kept the second half of that instruction when the clerk finished the English of the settlement, and Mr. Aldous Price, smooth as a man turning a card he had marked in advance, took up the reading in Latin, certain that the poor companion in the chair by the window would follow none of it. She did not yet know that the sentence he was about to read would be handed back to him, word for word, before the leaves turned red on the lime walk. Had she known, she would have let him finish just the same, and only smiled a little sooner. The library at Rushmere Hall smelled of beeswax and old paper, and faintly of roses the housekeeper had forgotten to clear from the mantel 3 days running. And into that mild, ordinary smell Aldous Price dropped a dead language, the way a man drops a stone into a well to learn how deep it runs. He was Julian Vane's solicitor, and had been his father's before him, and he wore his black coat as immaculately as a man wears a good conscience, which was, Grace had already begun to notice, not always the same thing as having one. Julian Vane, 7th Earl of Rushmere, stood at the window with his back half to the room, and if the reading troubled him he gave it none of his face. He was a large, still man, worn thin somewhere behind the eyes, and he had not spoken above a level voice since Grace had known him, which was 11 days. The Dowager Countess, his grandmother, sat with her cane across her knees, and her chin lifted like a woman waiting to be insulted so that she might enjoy correcting the insult. Sir Edmund Vale, the magistrate who had been named trustee under the 6th Earl's will, sat with his spectacles pushed up onto his brow, half listening, half admiring the ceiling plasterwork. It was, on its face, only the settling of a marriage that necessity had arranged rather than affection. The Earl of Rushmere would marry his grandmother's companion within the fortnight, for reasons the county was already inventing more colourfully than the truth deserved, and the lawyers had come to write down what she would and would not own once it was done. Price read on. Sui Heredis, he said, and something after it that was not sui juris, and Grace, whose father had drilled her in exactly this distinction across a decade of winter evenings, in a parish so poor it could not afford coal before November, felt the small, cold click of a lock turning wrong. She set down the cup she had been holding, squared it to the edge of the saucer as her father used to square his papers before he would allow himself to speak, and said, quite clearly, into the middle of Price's sentence, that he had mistranslated his own document. The room did what rooms do when a silence that has always been safe stops being safe. Price did not lower the page. "That is not possible, Miss Ashworth," he said, in the gentlest voice in the room, the voice of a man who has never in his life needed to raise it. "I beg to differ," said Grace. "You have written that my portion stands in fidei commissum, in trust, to be administered absolutely by the trustees named in the 3rd schedule, not by my husband, not by myself, by trustees. And of the 3 names in that schedule, sir, one of them is yours." Sir Edmund's spectacles came down off his brow very fast. The dowager's cane tapped the floor once, hard, a sound Grace would come to know as the old woman reaching for outrage and finding it exactly where she had left it. Julian turned from the window. He did not raise his voice. He had, Grace understood later, never needed to. He only asked Price, in a tone as level as a scale being balanced, whether it was true. "It is a customary form, my lord," Price said, and reached up to straighten a cuff that had not moved. "A formality only, in the language of such instruments, which no one but lawyers is expected to pass." "Then you will have no objection," said Julian, "to my wife passing it." He did not call her his wife by right yet. He called her that on purpose, and something in Grace's chest turned over at the deliberate wrongness of the tense, offered like a coin pushed across a table before the bargain was struck. Price's eyes went flat for the length of one breath. No longer than that, a door opening on a dark room and shutting again before anyone else could see what was kept there. And then he was all contrition, all clerical error, all I shall have the schedule redrawn directly, my lord, forgive an old man his old habits. He bowed his way through the correction so gracefully that within a quarter of an hour the room had half forgotten to be alarmed. Only Grace kept the memory whole, filed the way her father had taught her to file a suspicious entry, not accused yet, only marked, only watched. Sir Edmund, folding his spectacles, reminded the room, as though it were merely housekeeping, and not the hinge on which the whole visit turned, that the 6th Earl's will required his son married before his 30th birthday, or the estate would pass, in its management, if not its name, into the hands of the trustees named in that same troublesome schedule, which gave them, all told, 6 weeks, the deadline falling upon Michaelmas, when the rents came due and the tenants gathered in the long hall to pay them, and when, Sir Edmund said with the mild satisfaction of a man who liked his dates to align, the marriage would in any case be solemnized. 6 weeks, said the Dowager, is ample time to teach a man to smile at his own wedding, though it may not be ample time to teach a lawyer honesty. Price laughed with everyone else. Grace watched him laugh, and thought that she had never in her life heard a sound so carefully made. Julian found her an hour later in the garden, where she had gone to put her hands on something that did not require translating. He did not apologize for the scene in the library, which she had not expected and would have distrusted if offered. Instead, he stood at a little distance, as though he had learned, somewhere, that closeness needed to be earned in inches, and told her plainly what he wished the marriage to be. "I will not pretend this is what either of us would have chosen," he said. "My father's will chose it for me the day he wrote it, and your presence in that room 3 weeks ago, when half the county saw us there past midnight over nothing more scandalous than a torn ledger, chose it for you. I ask nothing of you but civility, and the honest keeping of this house, and I will ask nothing of your heart at all." Grace found, to her own surprise, that the flatness of the offer steadied her more than tenderness would have done. Tenderness, from a stranger, she would have doubted. "Then we are agreed on the terms," she said, "if not on the schedule. I have never needed anyone to translate my life for me, my lord, and I do not intend to begin now, in Latin or in English." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and did not survive long enough to become one. "Good," he said. "Then you will tell me directly when I have done something you dislike, rather than waiting 6 weeks and correcting my grammar in front of a magistrate." "I made no promises about the grammar," said Grace, and thought, with some alarm, that this was the nearest thing to teasing she had permitted herself in 3 years. He left her with a bow precise enough to be its own kind of honesty, and she stood a long while among the Dowager's roses, turning over what he had and had not said, which was, she was beginning to learn, always the larger portion of anything Julian Vane told her. The Dowager found her there next, moving with the particular briskness of an old woman who has decided a conversation is overdue. "Well," said Lady Honoria Vane, sitting herself upon the stone bench without waiting to be invited, "you have made an enemy of my late husband's solicitor in under a fortnight, which is faster than my husband managed it in 40 years of trying." "I did not mean to make an enemy," said Grace. "No one ever does," said the Dowager. "It is generally their most sincere accomplishment." She studied Grace with an attention that was not unkind, only thorough, the way she studied a hand of cards before she decided how ruthlessly to play it. "Your father," she said, "the curate who taught you Latin, as though you were a boy he meant to send to Oxford." Grace had not spoken of her father to anyone at Rushmere, beyond the barest facts required for a character reference, and she felt the old grief turn over, familiar and unhealed, like a stone in a shoe worn so long it had become part of the walking. He believed knowledge was not a sin, merely because it was inconvenient in a girl, she said. He taught me the way he would have taught a son, because he had no son, and because he could not afford to think of my education as an indulgence when it might one day be all I had to sell. He died of a fever 3 winters ago, with his accounts in better order than the bishop's, and left me nothing but his books and his handwriting, both of which I have found more useful than money. The dowager was silent a moment, which for her Grace was learning, was itself a form of tribute. "My son was much the same sort of fool about his own boy," she said at last, nodding toward the house, toward the window behind which Julian had gone. "Sent him to sea the year his mother died because he could not bear the shape of him at breakfast, and then spent his last 2 years wishing him home, and too proud to write and say so. Julian came back to find his father buried, and the estate half strangled by debts nobody had troubled to explain to him, and Aldous Price standing very ready with an explanation for everything. He has been grateful to that man for 8 years, said the dowager, tapping her cane once against the gravel, which is precisely the length of time it takes gratitude to curdle into blindness, if no one thinks to stir the pot. She rose, brushing invisible dust from her skirts, with the finality of a woman who has said what she came to say. "You correct Latin very prettily, Miss Ashworth," she said. "See that you learn to correct my grandson as well, when he wants it, which will be oftener than he admits." Price came to her 3 days later, ostensibly to have her sign a paper acknowledging receipt of the corrected settlement, and stayed rather longer than the paper required. He found her in the small parlour where the household accounts were kept, and admired, with every appearance of sincerity, the neatness of her columns. "You have a gift, Miss Ashworth," he said, seating himself without being asked, which I confess I did not expect to find in a companion's education. "Your late father's doing, I collect." "My father believed a mind was worth training whether or not the world had use for it," said Grace, not looking up from her ledger. "He would be pleased, I think, to know it has proved useful after all." Price smiled, and straightened a cuff that did not need straightening. A small, precise gesture Grace was coming to recognise, the way one learns to recognise weather before it breaks. "It is a rare gift," he said, "and rare gifts, in my experience, are seldom welcomed by those who have built their comfort on the assumption that no one is looking closely. A companion who reads Latin is an ornament. A companion who corrects a settlement in front of a magistrate is a complication, and complications, Miss Ashworth, have a way of finding themselves without situations, however cleverly they pass a sentence." He said it with such warmth that a stranger might have taken it for solicitude. Grace set down her pen and squared it to the edge of the desk. "Is that a threat, Miss Price?" she asked, "or merely an observation dressed as one, out of habit?" "Merely an observation," he said, rising, "and I hope you will not need it repeated." He bowed himself out with the same careful grace he had shown in the library, and Grace sat a long moment listening to his footsteps recede down the passage before she let her hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout, tremble once and be still again. Below stairs, she knew, The household had already made its verdict on the match. Several verdicts, in fact, circulating at once. That the Earl had been caught out and was doing the honourable thing. That the companion had caught the Earl out on purpose. That Mrs. Tilbury, the housekeeper, had a wager riding with the head groom on whether the pair would still be speaking to one another by Christmas. A wager Mrs. Tilbury reported to Grace herself, with the frank enjoyment of a woman who considered gossip a form of hospitality. "Let them wager," said Grace. "It costs nothing and warms the kitchen better than the coal ration." It was that same afternoon, going over the quarters accounts for the Dowager as she did every week, that she found the first crack in the wall she did not yet know was there. A payment of £11 entered in July, under the plain heading of repairs to the home farm. In a hand that was Price's clerk's, to a name she did not recognise, and which appeared nowhere else in 3 years of books. She did not think it fraud. She thought it strange, the way a missing button is strange before one realises the coat has been altered, and she copied the entry into the back of her own private book, the small one bound in grey paper that had been her father's, and thought no more of it that night, which was, she would come to believe, the last untroubled sleep she had at Rushmere Hall. The Michaelmas accounts wanted reconciling well before Michaelmas itself, and it was Julian, not the Dowager, who asked Grace to sit with him over them, an arrangement so unusual for a betrothed pair, let alone an engaged Earl and his intended Countess, that Mrs. Tilbury nearly dropped the tea-tray delivering it. They worked at the long table in the estate office through 3 evenings running, the ledgers spread between them like a country neither had properly mapped, and Grace discovered that Julian Vane, stripped of an audience, talked more in an hour of figures than he had in a fortnight of courtship. He told her, without being asked, that he had been at sea when his father began to fail, 3 years running, and that the letters home had grown shorter and less honest on both sides, until there was nothing left to write that was not a lie of omission dressed as filial duty. "I told myself I stayed away because the service required it," he said, turning a page he was not reading. "The truth is smaller and less forgivable. I did not know how to watch a strong man become a weak one, and so I let the sea do my deciding for me." Grace did not offer him comfort, sensing correctly that he would have refused it. Instead, she offered him the shape of her own losses, which he had not asked for, and received all the same. "My father died in a single week," she said, "of a fever that took half the parish that winter, and I was not there either, being 3 days distant nursing an aunt who lived a further 6 years out of pure spite. We do not get to choose which absences we are forgiven for, my lord." "Some men would call that unjust," said Julian. "What would you call it?" Grace asked, and he considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant. "Ordinary," he said finally. Which is worse? It was over the 3rd evening's ledgers that Grace, tracing a column of figures with the pen's dry end, made some dry remark about lawyers being the only tradesmen paid handsomely to make simple sentences difficult to understand. And Julian Vane laughed, not the courteous exhale she had heard him produce twice at dinner, but a real, startled sound, quickly suppressed, as though laughter were a debt he had not budgeted for and did not entirely trust himself to pay. Grace looked up, and something in her chest noted the sound the way her father's ledgers noted a rare good entry, and set it carefully aside to be remembered. "You should do that oftener," she said. "It suits you better than the stillness does. I have not had much cause. Of late," he said, and did not elaborate. But the stillness, when it returned, sat differently on him for the rest of the evening, as though a window long painted shut had been forced an inch. A robin had taken up residence in the yew outside the office window, and sang through most of that third evening with the particular indifference of a creature that owes nothing to anyone's ledger, and Grace found herself listening for it the way one listens, without meaning to, for a friend's step on the stair. She told Julian, that night, one part of what her father had left her. The Grey Book, she called it, holding up the small volume for him to see, his private accounts and his private jokes both, in a shorthand only she could read now that he was gone. But she did not tell him of the £11 paid to a stranger's name in July, some caution older than reason keeping that particular entry to herself a while longer, a small, deliberate withholding she would later come to regret, and, in the same breath, understand. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as concern. Price brought it to Julian alone, in the estate office, 3 pages copied in a hand any careless eye would have sworn was Grace's own. Her loops, her particular way of crossing a 3 entries in the Dowager's household accounts, inflated against the receipts Grace herself had filed. The difference, some £40 across 2 months. Unaccounted for. I take no pleasure in this, my lord, Price said, and had the decency, or the cunning, to look as though he meant it. I have watched Miss Ashworth's gift for figures with real admiration. It grieves me more than I can say to find that same gift may have been turned to less admirable use. Julian studied the pages a long while in silence, his hand flat on the table, very still. The stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it. It is not her hand, he said at last, though something in his voice admitted he was less certain than the words claimed. Forgery is a common enough talent among clerks, my lord, said Price gently, and I would not for the world accuse a lady on the strength of ink alone. I say only that the sums do not reconcile, and that Miss Ashworth alone has held the keys to that particular desk these 3 months. He left the pages on the table, and left Julian alone with them, which was, Grace would later understand, the entire design of the visit, not to convince, but to plant a doubt that would do its own convincing, slowly in private, where no correction could reach it. Julian did not come to her that night, nor the next, and when at last he did, it was not to ask her outright, but to request with careful neutrality that Sir Edmund Vale be given quiet leave to review the Dowager's household accounts before the wedding. As a formality only, he said, the very word Price had used in the library, and Grace heard it land in her own chest with the same cold click as the misread clause had landed 3 weeks before. A formality, she repeated. You wish a magistrate to audit my bookkeeping as a formality, and did not think, before arranging it, to tell me why. I did not wish to alarm you over what may be nothing, said Julian. I did not wish, said Grace, to learn from Mrs. Tilbury, who had it from the boot boy, who had it from Sir Edmund's own clerk, that my honesty is under quiet review before I had the chance to defend it myself. That is not protection, my lord. That is being managed, and I have been managed by better liars than you all my life. He did not raise his voice, and neither did she, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. 2 people who had learned, each for their own reasons, that composure was the only armour either of them trusted, standing very still and doing one another real harm with it. It was not 2 days later that Price came to her a second time, in the small parlour again, and this time he did not threaten, he offered. A purse, generous beyond what her situation warranted, and a letter of character already drafted in his own careful hand, praising her competence and her discretion to any future employer who might inquire. If she would only, he said, spare his lordship the unpleasantness of a public inquiry, and remove herself from Rushmere before Michaelmas quietly, with her reputation, such as it was, still intact. It would grieve no one, he said. It would spare everyone. Grace looked at the purse a long moment, long enough that Price's mouth curved with the beginning of satisfaction. And then she closed the lid of it herself and pushed it back across the table with 2 fingers, the way one returns something spoiled. "I did not correct your Latin for a purse, Mr. Price," she said, "and I will not leave for one either. If I am guilty, let it be proved in the light, before witnesses, the way any honest matter is proved. If I am not, I find I would rather stay and be vindicated than run, and be believed guilty by everyone who never troubled to ask." It was, she understood even as she said it, the costliest sentence of her life, and she said it without a tremor, which cost her a great deal more than the sentence did. The inquiry, when Sir Edmund conducted it a week later before the Dowager, and at Price's careful insistence before Julian, found what such inquiries are designed to find when the books have been prepared in advance to find it. The £40 could not be accounted for. The hand, though disputed, could not be wholly cleared, and Sir Edmund, a fair man working with unfair materials, could only recommend, with visible reluctance, that Miss Ashworth be relieved of her duties respecting the household accounts pending further investigation, and that the wedding, for propriety's sake, be quietly deferred until the matter was resolved. Julian did not argue the point in the room, and it was that silence, more than anything Price had engineered, that broke something in Grace she had thought Price's purse incapable of touching. She had asked to be proved in the light, and instead had watched the man she was to marry choose, when the moment came, the safety of delay over the risk of her defence, and she understood, with the particular clarity of grief, that he had done it believing it was mercy, a decision made for her, about her, without her. The exact shape of the unilateral protection he could not yet see was its own kind of cruelty. She was given a week's notice to remove to the dower cottage at the edge of the park, her keys taken with careful courtesy by Mrs. Tilbury, who wept doing it, and would not meet her eyes. It was in that week, forbidden the estate office and its ledgers, that Grace, unable to sit idle with an accusation hanging over her like weather that would not break, went instead to the one room no one had thought to lock against her, the old Earl's private study, untouched since his death, its desk still holding his letters and his spectacles as though he had only stepped out to dress for dinner. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unanswered correspondence, she found a small book bound in grey paper, twin to her own father's in everything but the hand that had filled it, and in the margins of the 6th Earl's private accounts, in a shorthand of abbreviated Latin, any careful daughter of a schoolmaster would recognise at a glance. She found 3 years of a dying man's growing suspicion, figures that did not reconcile, a name queried and never resolved, and against the entry for the previous July, in ink gone brown with age, the single word suspectus, suspected, beside a sum of £11 paid to a name Grace had copied into her own grey book 3 months before, and never yet spoken aloud to anyone. She was still sitting with the book open on her knees, the fire long since gone to ash, when Mrs. Tilbury came to her with a face gone the colour of tallow, carrying a letter sealed with Price's own hand, summoning the household and the tenantry both to the great hall on the morning of Michaelmas, to settle, the letter said, in the presence of Sir Edmund Vale and such witnesses as the occasion required, the question of the disputed accounts, and, the letter added, with a delicacy that made the threat beneath it unmistakable, the question of whether the marriage so long delayed ought, in light of all that had come to light, to proceed at all, The Dowager Countess did not wait to be asked. She had never, in 81 years, waited to be asked for anything she had already decided to do, and what she had decided, upon hearing of the summons, was that she would not lose the granddaughter she had chosen twice over, once by employing her, and once, more privately, by loving her, to a solicitor's arithmetic. She went herself, that same night, in a closed carriage with no lamp lit, to Sir Edmund Vale's house 4 miles distant, and roused him from his bed to tell him plainly that she had kept, these 40 years, every letter her late husband had ever written her regarding the management of the estate, including several in which he had expressed, gently but unmistakably, a distrust of Aldous Price's father that he had never lived to act upon, and that she would swear before God and the county both that the family's suspicion of that name ran a generation deeper than anyone at Rushmere had troubled to admit. "It is not proof," Sir Edmund said, reading them by candlelight in his dressing-gown, "but it is a pattern, my lady. And patterns matter in a hearing where a single ledger will otherwise be one man's word against another's." It was the Dowager, too, who thought to send word to Delphine Carew, the heiress Price had for 2 years quietly promoted as a more suitable match for Julian than any penniless companion could ever be, reasoning correctly that a woman used as an instrument seldom enjoys the discovery once it is made plain to her. Delphine came to Rushmere the following afternoon pale and precise, touching the seam of her glove the way she always did when choosing her words with care, and told Grace, without being asked twice, that Price had for a year encouraged her to believe an understanding existed between herself and the Earl, had coached her in small ways to seem indispensable to the family's comfort, and had, only a fortnight past, sent her a letter in his own hand, instructing her to let it be known in company that Miss Ashworth's father had left his parish under a cloud of debt and disgrace. A lie, Delphine said, and I did not repeat it, because even I could see what shape of man asks such a thing of a woman he claims to admire. She produced the letter itself, folded small inside her glove, Price's hand unmistakable across every damning line. Julian, meanwhile, had spent the same 2 days doing the one thing his pride had not permitted him until Grace was gone from the house to make its necessity plain to him. He went, alone and at night, to the estate office, and set Price's account books beside his father's private ledger and his own memory of every figure Grace had ever shown him, and found, entry after entry, the same practised hand disguising small repeated thefts behind the honest clutter of a great house's expenses, a pattern 8 years deep, patient as rust. He found Sowerby, Price's young clerk, in the estate yard near midnight, unable to sleep for reasons his face made plain before his mouth did, and asked him only one question, gently, the way Grace might have asked it, whether it was his hand that had copied the July entry, or whether he had merely been told, by someone he trusted, that copying it was no crime at all. Sowerby did not answer that night, but he did not deny it either, and a man who cannot deny a question has already, in every way that matters, begun to answer it. Julian came to the Dower cottage at first light, his coat still creased from the night's work, and stood in Grace's doorway, with none of his usual composure left to hide behind. "I was wrong," he said before she could speak, "to decide what protecting you should look like, without once asking you what you wish to be protected from. I will not make that error again, if you will let me stand beside you tomorrow instead of in front of you." Grace, who had spent the night with a dead man's grey book of suspicions open on her knees, found she had no pride left to spend on making him wait for forgiveness he had already. In the only way that counted, earned, "Then stand beside me," she said, "and bring the ledgers. We will need every page of them." Michaelmas morning came in cold and very clear, the kind of light that makes a room reluctant to keep secrets, and the great hall at Rushmere filled early, tenants come to pay their rents, the household come out of unashamed curiosity. Sir Edmund at the long table with his spectacles already down upon his nose, the dowager beside him with her cane set upright like a standard planted before battle. Price arrived immaculate, a black mourning ring turning once on his smallest finger before he folded his hands, and opened the proceeding himself, with evident regret, by laying before Sir Edmund the 3 disputed pages, and inviting Miss Ashworth, if she was able, to explain them. Grace rose, and did not raise her voice, because she had learned, across 11 weeks at Rushmere, that the loudest voice in a room is rarely the one believed. "I cannot explain a forgery I did not commit," she said, "but I can show this hall what it conceals." She set upon the table, beside Price's own books, the grey volume that had been the 6th Earl's, open to the page marked Suspectus, and beside it her father's small grey book, with the same July entry, copied in her own hand 3 months before either page had been called into question, and beside that, Price's account for the same month, and read them aloud together, in the plain light through the tall windows, so that every figure could be heard to agree or to quarrel as it truly did. The £11 paid to repairs on the home farm, she said, was paid in truth to no farm at all, but to an apothecary's account in the next county, the same apothecary, tenants of this hall will recall, who attended the late Earl in his final illness. And I do not say what that payment purchased, only that it was hidden, and a thing hidden costs more to explain than a thing declared. She turned then to Sowerby, who stood near the door as though he might yet escape through it, and asked him the one question Julian had left unasked in the yard 2 nights before. "Whose hand copied this entry? Mr. Sowerby," she said, "yours or mine? And if it was yours, who told you it would never be read closely enough to matter?" The hall went very still, the particular stillness of a great many people holding their breath at once, and Sowerby, who had spent 2 sleepless nights already halfway to confession, broke entirely. It was his hand, he said. It had always been his hand. For 8 years he had copied what he was told to copy, and asked no questions, because questions were not paid for, and he was sorry, God help him, he was sorry. And he had never once been told to forge a lady's writing until a fortnight past, when Mr. Price himself had brought him 3 blank pages and Miss Ashworth's old household requisitions to copy the shape of her hand from. Price did not move for a long moment. Then, with the smoothness of a man reaching for one last card, he began to speak of malice and coincidence, and a clerk too frightened to know his own memory, until Julian, who had said almost nothing until then, laid upon the table a letter in Price's own hand, taken from among his father's private papers that very night, 8 years old, addressed to no one living, in which a younger, more desperate Aldous Price had written of physicians' bills he could not meet for a daughter not expected to see the spring, and of the shame of a man who must choose, God forgive him, between honesty and his own child's dying comfort. "I read it 3 times before I understood it," Julian said, and understood at last, that it explains a man without excusing what he built upon the explanation, once the need for it had long passed. Price's hand went still on the mourning ring. For one unguarded moment the whole immaculate architecture of him gave way, and what stood revealed beneath it was not a villain enjoying his ruin, but an old man remembering a small coffin, and the hall, which had gathered for a reckoning, found itself, unwillingly, moved to something nearer pity, It was Sir Edmund who spoke the judgment, and Julian who shaped its mercy. There will be no charge laid, and no scandal published beyond these walls, Julian said. You will have an allowance sufficient to live without want, and a cottage in the next county, far enough that the tenants here need not see, daily, the shape of what was taken from them. I do this not for your comfort, Mr. Price, but because this hall has tenants who depend on its good name surviving this morning intact, and because my father, whatever his failures of watchfulness, would not have wished a man's grief paraded as entertainment. Go, and be grateful, and do not mistake mercy for forgiveness. The first I can give freely, the second is not mine to give at all. Price, who had spoken gently through every cruelty he had ever committed, left the hall in complete silence, and Delphine Carew, watching him go, said quietly to Grace that she was glad, after all, to have been made a fool of by a man clever enough that even the wise had trusted him, since it meant, at least, that her own misjudgment had been in good company. It was 3 evenings later, the grey books closed at last and returned to their proper drawers, that Julian found Grace in the garden among the last of the dowager's roses, and did not begin, this time, with terms. I told you once I would ask nothing of your heart, he said. I find I was wrong about that too, and I am becoming used to the sensation. I do not offer you my name now because a will requires it, or because a scandal must be answered, or because any account anywhere needs balancing. Those debts are paid. I ask you now because I find I no longer wish to read my own life without your correcting hand somewhere on the page, not to translate it for me, since you told me once you had never needed anyone to translate your life for you. And I find I would rather stand beside a woman who reads for herself than marry one who waits to be told what a sentence means. Marry me, Grace, because you wish it, and for no other clause in any schedule anywhere. The robin that had nested in the yew all that autumn sang, from somewhere near the office window, as though it owed the moment nothing and gave it everything regardless. And Grace, whose father had taught her that a clause misread is a fortune misspent, thought that a heart too might be misread the very same way, and was glad beyond speaking that this one, at least, had been corrected in time. They were married quietly within the month, in the small chapel at Rushmere, with no more than 40 souls to witness it, the dowager weeping without shame through the whole of the register signing, and declaring loudly afterward that she had not cried so freely since her own wedding, which everyone present understood to be a fond exaggeration, and no one troubled to correct. Mrs. Tilbury wept too, and blamed the onions from the wedding breakfast, though there were none. Sir Edmund gave the bride away, in the absence of any father to do it, and told her privately afterward that her own father, whom he had never met, would have been prouder of the hearing in the great hall than of any wedding that followed it, which Grace thought was very likely true, and treasured all the same. Delphine Carew, within the year, removed to Bath with her aunt, and there met a widowed clergyman, of excellent temper and indifferent fortune, who valued her precision more than her portion, and wrote to Grace twice a year in a hand-grown warmer with every letter. Sowerby kept on at Julian's own insistence that a frightened man taught honesty was worth more than a clean man never tested, rose in time to keep the estate's books himself, scrupulously, and was known ever after to check his own figures 3 times before he trusted them. Aldous Price lived out his years in the next county, in a small, well-kept cottage, tending a garden he had never had time for while thieving, and was visited once a year at Michaelmas by Julian alone, who never told Grace what passed between them, and she never asked, understanding that some mercies are private the way some griefs are. The grey book that had been the 6th Earl's was given a glass case in the estate office, beside Grace's own father's smaller volume. Two men who had never met bound together at last by a granddaughter and daughter neither had lived to see married. Near a year later, on a bright, cool morning much like the one that had begun it all, Grace sat in the Rushmere library with a girl from the village at her elbow, the blacksmith's daughter, sharp-eyed and hungry for letters, the way Grace herself had once been, and read aloud a line of simple Latin, and waited, smiling, while the girl puzzled out its meaning for herself rather than being told. Julian, passing the open door with their infant son against his shoulder, paused to listen, and Grace, without looking up, said that a clause misread was a fortune misspent, but that a heart misread might yet be corrected, if only someone troubled to read it twice. And Julian Vane, 7th Earl of Rushmere, who had once gone a decade without laughing above a courteous exhale, laughed outright in his own library, unguarded, entirely his, and did not mind at all that his wife had, once again, had the last and truest word. If this story warmed you, if you have ever sat silent in a room while people decided, in a language they thought was locked against you, what your life was worth, and found, in the end, that you had the key all along, then stay a little longer by the fire with me. The kettle is on, the candle is lit, and there is a chair kept warm for anyone who has ever been underestimated and lived to correct the record. Tell me below which line stayed with you longest, or what you would have said in Grace's place when the Latin turned against her, and if you have not already done so, stay close and subscribe, so there is always a place kept for you here when the next story is told. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the quiet, competent people in your own life, who are, more often than anyone admits, reading every clause far more closely than they are given credit for.